Hello guys, welcome back to my channel. Dropping Needle Legs here. Back today with another top 10 music top 10 today. Today I'm going through my top 10 favourite Gary Numan albums. Now I've been a Gary Numan fan since I first saw him in 1980. I saw him at Hammersmith Odeon. That was my very first Gary Numan concert. And then I saw him the following year at Wembley, 1981. He did his farewell concerts at Wembley Arena because he was retiring from music just because of all the sort of death threats and stuff he was getting and bad press and things like this. So he retired from music. It didn't last very long because he came back, and all he pretty much did was retire from touring for a few years. Because whilst he did that, he recorded a few more albums, and then he came back in about 1983, back on the road touring. Obviously, if you're drawn to something and you love it, then it's difficult to give that up. It's not always about money, but sometimes it's something that you love doing. So anyway, yeah, I've been a fan of his for a long time. I've met him a couple of times. It's a nice chap, quite a quiet spoken chap, but he's quite a pleasant person to speak to. Spoke to him a few times about some of my ideas that I have for his music. Probably what are you talking about? But anyway, I've met him a few times and he's a really nice guy. But like I said, I followed him a lot and I've seen him so many times. Not as much as a New Model Army, but I've seen him pretty much every single tour he's done. Apart from the last couple of years, I've not been to his shows. Again, shows now are becoming so overpriced. Like when I first saw Gary Numan, it was about £3 or £4, at Hammersmith, and now it's like you're looking at £40, £45. So it's a big difference. So anyway, before I get to my top 10 favourites, I've got a few honourable mentioned albums of his. First of all, it's a live album called Engineers. This is an early recording in, I believe it's New Zealand. It was recorded, and I believe it's from the Telly Tour 1980. It's a really, really good recording. This was a sort of an official sort of bootleg, and it went around for years as a bootleg, but finally got a proper release on the Gary Numan label. I'm not sure if it's available anymore, but it was available for a short period on his website, so that's good to get. An earlier album of his now an honourable mention. That's I Assassin. This is one of the albums that he did, but I told you when he retired from the music industry, he released a couple of albums, Dance and I Assassins. Dance came out the same sort of time that he did his farewell concerts, and this one he released after that. It's quite a good album. It's got some sort of like really good tracks on there. People know, like Music for Chameleons and stuff like that. And he started to change his look there, going for the old gangster look there. Another honourable mention is a more of a modern one, which is really, really cool. It's called Dead Sun Rising. I believe this is like a compilation of songs that he released an album called Jagged, and this was songs that he didn't put on there but had sort of sitting around it, and he created a whole new album out of it. And it's a really, really good album, Dead Sun Rising. Another honourable mention is because I'd say after his sort of 80, sort of around about 85 to 86, around to about 95, he had a bit of a slum, and he released some albums that weren't the best. Yeah, I think he did. He tried to sort of experiment a bit too much with sort of like a sort of funky sound and sort of like saxophones, and it just sort of like lost its way because everyone liked Gary Numan because his music was dark, and it was really sort of synth driven and really sort of dark, and the lyrics were very sort of like Android, sort of an isolated sort of lyrics. And then he sort of like went and sort of did some albums that were a little bit more. I think he tried to, because he started his own record company um, after he did his farewell concerts called Numa Records, and it lost him a lot of money because of the albums that he was releasing. It just didn't hit what people wanted to hear. But in 1995, he sort of made a comeback with this one, Sacrifice. Now, in interviews, he talks about how he was listening to uh, albums like Songs of Faith and Devotion by Depeche Mode, and how they sort of turned their sound around, and it sort of influenced him to do the same. And he came back with a more sort of harder, darker sound. And then this album took him off again. He went back into sort of like getting a really strong sort of following, and it was a really, really good album. And I think this was the album that sort of turned him back around uh, to the sort of goth sort of scene almost, because then he went on to listen to other sort of like industrial bands that are around, like Nine Inch Nails and things like that, and they tend to influence some of his later albums. My last honourable mention is a live one from 1979, and it's Living Ornaments 79. This was recorded at Hammersmith Odeon. They released this originally as a record in the box set, Living Ornaments 79 and Living Ornaments 80. The 81 is the one I went to see him at, my very first show. So that's a very special album to me. But they were like 10 song LPs. But now you can buy like the whole set, like the whole concert set. So it's like 20 songs so it's the whole show. And that's fantastic. And it's been remastered really well. So we get to my top 10 favourite Gary Numan albums. And at number 10, I've still got the ticket price on this. I never took it off. Don't know why. It's my favorite. It's my very first Gary Numan show. This is Living Ornaments 1980. So this again recorded at Hammersmith in 1980, and it's the whole set. It's got, I don't know how many songs it's got on it. 30 songs. He did when he plays. He does like a 2-hour set. So it's like 30 songs. And again, it was released as a double CD, and it's got all the photos and stuff from the original show from when I first saw Gary in 1980 at Hammersmith. A great picture of him there. He was fantastic. He was mesmerising on stage. It really was. He was just like nothing I've never seen. And being so young, 1980, I'd have been about 13 or 14. And I'm like, wow, it's just the greatest. This guy is the greatest thing that's ever walked, you know. And I thought that, you know, at the time, because you just do, don't you? You're young. And I just was so into Gary Numan. And it was just before I discovered The Cure. And then I got into The Cure heavily. So anyway, number 9 is again more one of the sort of modern ones. And this is Jagged. This is a really good album. It's signed there by Gary. When I went to meet him, he signed that one for me on the tour. It's a really good album. And it's got that sort of really heavy industrial sound, like a Nine Inch Nails sort of sound to it. So it's got a lot of atmospheric sampling in there. Lots of sort of like heavy, dark, deep synth lines, plus got some sort of almost sort of metal like guitars over the top. It's a really, really good album, Jagged. If you're into sort of like your metal sort of industrial sound, check out Jagged. It's a really, really good album. Number 8 is his second album that he released in 1979, and it's Replicas by Tube Army. He released an album before this called Tube Army. That's not in here. That's a very punk sort of album. It's hardly any synthesizers in it. It's more of a punk album. But this was the one that he first sort of did with like the synth sound on it, and it contains like the famous songs "Down in the Park" and "Our Friends Electric." So yeah, this is 1979 Replicas. Really good album. When I owned it on vinyl, and again I just played it non-stop. Really, absolutely loved it. Our Friends Electric was just massive when it came out, and then he released Cars afterwards, and I loved Cars, but on the B side of Cars there was a song called Asylum, and I played that more than that because it was an instrumental and it was so dark. It sounded like a horror film sort of thing. But yeah, Our Friends Electric's on this one, the Replicas. This was Tube Army. He did 2 albums under the name of Tube Army, and that was their second effort. And that is in at number 8. Number 7, it's an album that he recorded just before he did his farewell concerts in 1981, and this is Dance. Again, you could tell that he was starting to change the way he was, because when he was before that, he was always in sort of jumpsuits or a black shirt with a red tie, thin tie, and he had a very sort of android robot look about him. And this is when he just started to change his sort of look, experiment a bit more. I think he was heavily influenced by David Bowie. So, and David Bowie was renowned for changing his character. And I think Gary was trying to do the same sort of thing. He did this, and then he did one where he had blonde hair like Mad Max. Then he did another one where he had the white jumpsuit and the blue hair and blue lips and everything. You know, he tried to change his sort of persona for every album, which worked to a point. But then it just sort of lost way when it went to that sort of funky period, and he just sort of like wear a leathery sort of jacket with his chest bared, and that. It's thought, no, it's just weird. But yeah, this is a really good album. It contains the singles She's Got Claws. It contains Roger Taylor plays on this, the drummer of Queen. He plays on this album. There's quite a few guest musicians playing on this album. Yeah, it's a really good album. I really do like it. Really cool. So that was my number 7. Number 6 was the one he did just after Sacrifice, and it's called Exile. This is another really good album. It's a very sort of dark synth album. With a little bit of a sort of heavy guitar background, but the vocals on this are very melodic, and it's very sort of laid back vocals, but that works so well, and this album is such a good listen. It's a really, really good album. And that sort of like logo was pretty cool. I think quite a few Gary Numan fans went and got that tattooed on them. I've got a few Gary Numan tattoos, of course, because I've been a fan for such a long time, but that's a really, really good album. What am I down to now? Number 5 next. Number 5 was his I call it his 9 Inch Nails album, and it's Pure. This was the one that really made him come back to popularity. He had a song on it called Rip, and that, and just some really, it's a very dark, very heavy sort of electronic metal sounding album. Really, really good, and it's really very 9 Inch Nails sort of sounding, and very, very cool, really popular with the fans. And it's got some amazing songs, and I think this album is what's brought him back to being really popular today. Well, there we go. Number 4 is his second album as just Gary Numan, and it's come out in 1980, and it's Telecom. Really, really good album. Again, it's an iconic album. It's got songs like This Wreckage on there. It's just a fantastic album. But this is the album to see perform live, because it's just fantastic live. I absolutely love it. It's such a good album. Just love Telecom, and that's my number 4. Number 3 is a live album, and it's his farewell concert in 1981, and it's Living Ornaments 81. Again, I was at this show, so it's fantastic to have this there. It was a very emotional show, seeing someone that you absolutely adore and loved every sort of bit of music they did, calling it a day. We're all a wreck at the end of the night, you know. Even Gary was. You can see it in, because it got released as a film. I got it on DVD, called Living Ornaments. I think Micro. Is it Micro Music? Yeah, I think it's called Micro Music, the DVD. I've got a copy of that. But that's really, really cool. That's his farewell concert in 1981. Of course, it didn't last, because he came back, as I said, in 1983, and he released Warriors, my second favourite album of Gary Numan. This was released in 1983. This was his Mad Max stage that I was telling you about. Again, this is a very special album to me, just because it was like, yeah, we'd all thought he was not going to play anymore, and we thought we're never going to see Gary Numan ever again. And then 2 years later, he announced a new album and a tour, and I went to see him. Did 2 or 3 nights at Hammersmith. I went to see him all the shows on that tour. Really, really cool. Well, at the Hammersmith shows. This has the singles Warriors and Sister Surprise on it. Really, really good album. And that's when he was on Beggar Banquets Records then. Whoops. Yeah, fantastic album. So my number 1 spot has to be left, doesn't it? Because it's been in my top 10 albums of all time, so it's got to be my favourite Gary Numan album, and that's The Pleasure Principle. This was his first solo album, 1979. Contains the single Cars. He didn't release many singles off albums back then. He released maybe one or two, because quite a few of his singles weren't on albums. We Are Glass and I Die You Die and things like that were just basically singles. He didn't release them, and I loved that because I was just thinking it's great because when you buy the album, it's not full of songs you've already got as singles. So I quite like that he did that, and it's a great album. It's a very dark synth sound. It's 100% sort of synthesizer sound, and it's brilliant. Uh, some of my favourite tracks on this are Films and Me. Fantastic songs. Great album. And that's my top 10 favourite Gary Numan albums. Are you into Gary Numan? Did you ever go to see him, or have you ever seen him? Let me down below. What are your favourite albums? Are you interested in checking him out? Now, if you are, I recommend you check out Pleasure Principle and Pure. Are the two albums I'd recommend you checking out if you're just getting into him. So you can see him from both sort of like his career, his beginning, and to more modern. So check it out anyway. Anyway, guys, till next time, look after yourselves, and I really hope I see you all soon.